Well, it's time for us to begin our last session, so if everyone could take their seats, we'll begin. So our final panel today is entitled Bringing the Ancestors Home, Experiences in International Repatriation. And we've got three really quite interesting and compelling cases to think about today with you. I'm fortunate enough to also be able to moderate this session, so I'm now going to move from here over to there. So our three panelists, the Honorable Kim Beazley, the Australian Ambassador to the United States. If you look in your program, you'll see he's got quite an illustrious history, involved in all kinds of governmental and educational kinds of things, honored, recognized, and awarded throughout Australia for his wonderful work. And he'll be speaking to us about a quite interesting and a quite compelling repatriation between our own institution and Australia. And then Richard Luarke, the governor of the Pueblo of Laguna, serving his fourth year as governor, a wide range of experience in business and government. He also has a really interesting case study to put before us in terms of international auctions and international auction houses. And then finally, Cecil Pavlat Sr., Sault Ste. Marie. He is the cultural repatriation specialist for the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and has been for the last 15 years. He's heading into retirement soon, so we can wish him well with that. For those of us in Michigan, whenever we speak of NAGPRA, a lot of times we also have another acronym along with it, which is MACPRA. And if one doesn't enunciate them clearly, NAGPRA and MACPRA kind of start to sound a little bit alike. But MACPRA is the Michigan Anishinaabe Cultural Preservation and Repatriation Alliance, a really important thing in our state in terms of allowing tribes to work together and to coordinate. He's a founding member and the previous chairperson of that organization. So without further ado, Ambassador Beazley, I think I will turn things over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Governor, fellow panellists, ladies and gentlemen. The Australian government and the French government have organised something very exciting from my point of view for this session. And that is yesterday, currently, give you context, currently Australia has just concluded hosting the G20 meeting in Brisbane, and that has spun off to three bilateral head of state visits, one by Chinese President Xi, one by Indian Prime Minister Modi, and one by the French President Francois Hollande. And they've got all those sorts of deliverables that governments like to have associated with those visits to do something significant in the context of Chinese-Australian relations or Indian-Australian relations. In the case of the French, the principal deliverable is the signature of an agreement on repatriation of Indigenous remains between Australia and France. So given the freshness of this, I thought I'd read from the crucial paragraph of the agreement just reached. The governments of the two countries will establish a joint expert committee to coordinate and determine the processes needed to identify and also to ascertain the origin of the Indigenous Australian human remains conserved in French public collections. This committee will be steered for France by the Ministry of Culture in liaison with the French National Museum of Natural History, and for Australia by the Ministry for the Arts and the Advisory Committee for Indigenous Repatriation, and include experts from France and from Australia. So this is another point of success, I think, for the Australian government's initiative begun nearly a couple of decades ago to put system and the government behind the repatriation process. It's absolutely critical for us on so many levels. One level, of course, the simple humanity in relation to the original Australians. Another level because the collection of original Australian remains was in the 19th century an exercise that was very actively pursued, because there was a recognition that this was a culture and a group that had developed largely independent of just about anything else going on globally, and that they had a continuous history. Back in those days, of course, it was regarded as, and nobody could make those calculations, a continuous history of 20,000 years. In reality, it's now admitted, proved to 40, but the assumption is 60. And interesting to reflect that when humanity came out of the last ice age, the most advanced culture on Earth was the Australian Indigenous culture. Hard to think that, hard to contemplate that. But that was the case, and one of the reasons essentially was, if you look at Australia geologically, geographically, humanity in Australia did not take the hits from the Ice Age that folk in the Northern Hemisphere did. And of course, further south to Australia, there's nobody there at all. And so there was a high survival rate amongst the Indigenous community in Australia, and basically, as you can discern Australian Aboriginal culture, there is no break point in it that you could identify with the Ice Age. It is continuous, and in the legends, because it's immensely verbal transmission of information, there's no real intersection with what you might describe as any Ice Age events. Well, the Ice Age rubbed out. I mean, the Ice Age had horrific effects on the Native American population at the time, but for Australians, pretty well nothing at all. So this is the latest of what has been a relatively successful handling at a governmental level of a completely horrible story. And there'd been sporadic attempts made over the years prior to that point of time, around about 2000. Some were successful, and many were not. There's a lot of media attention attracted, which in turn had a positive effect on the pressures to create the movement for the return of Indigenous Australian remains. And the 2007 Article 12, this later into the operation actually, of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, highlighted the need for international cooperation in a challenging and dynamic area. And with the changing attitudes of cultural institutions, academics and scientists, they've created an environment conducive to the sorts of changes now in place. Well, the first of our agreements was between Australia and the United Kingdom, and that was a joint declaration signed in 2000. That was to increase the efforts to repatriate ancestral remains from collecting institutions in the UK. And the first Australian government policy on Indigenous repatriation was released in 2004. And the government then committed itself to actively seeking the repatriation of ancestral remains from overseas institutions. I was involved in Australian politics for years, and you think that you're partisan in the United States. You don't know anything about it. And compared to what we are like, we are truly horrific. And but because we run a Westminster system, our bitterness is controlled to a degree. And what is really interesting about this, the dates that I'm giving you are dates of Conservative administrations in Australia. Very important to comprehend that. They're not the political organisation most identified with a sympathetic attitude to Indigenous Australians. But these events occurred, and indeed did the signing of that agreement with the French yesterday, in periods of time of Conservative administration in Australia. I was what you would call a social democrat, so I have a different persuasion. But this is an interesting facet of the character of the development of policy in Australia. The government policy identified in 2004 provides financial and diplomatic support for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to work with the institutions. And our embassies assist Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to negotiate the return of ancestral remains. We cover the cost of the repatriation, and those costs include travel by traditional owners to accompany ancestral remains on their return to Australia, which is, as I'll just outline briefly to conclude, an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. It is very difficult to repatriate remains. The Act also established an advisory committee for Indigenous repatriation, and the members of that committee are exclusively Indigenous Australians, and they provide advice to the Australian government on issues related to repatriation. Well, to date, the program has facilitated the return of over 1,400 ancestral remains and over 1,400 secret sacred objects from within Australian collections, and brought home more than 1,200 ancestral remains to Australia from overseas. So it's of course also from Australia, but 1,200 from overseas. Institutions in the UK, the Czech Republic and Germany, as well as the US, have returned ancestral remains. And with the assistance of the Australian Embassy here in DC, the Australian Ministry for the Arts works directly with cultural institutions in the United States to progress repatriations. Recent returns include 2012, the Harvard Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, the Berlin Ethnology Museum, returned a known Bundjalung elder to their home community in New South Wales, and this elder had been held since the late 19th century. Also in 2012, the Stanford Archaeology Centre returned 2 sets of unprovenanced remains. In 2010, the Smithsonian Natural History Museum undertook a return of 9 ancestral remains from the Gunbalanya, the Cape Stewart, Milingimbi, and the Groote Island communities in Arnhem Land. In 2009-2010, following a decade of lobbying by Aboriginal communities and the Australian government, the Smithsonian Institution repatriated ancestral remains taken during the 1948 American-Australian scientific expedition to Arnhem Land. Now, I had a degree of personal involvement in that almost from the outset. The biggest scientific expedition ever done in Australia was done in 1948, and it was organised on the Australian side by the Australian government and on the American side by National Geographic and the Smithsonian. And it was an extraordinary expedition. There were all sorts of politics in the mix associated with it. A lot of it had to do with the outcome of the Second World War, when Australia recognised the vulnerability of its northern parts. And it was preparatory to trying to increase substantially the populations of the north of Australia. So that was a sort of a political subset of the rationales behind it. It was also, the rationale was that truth is that when you look at the consequence of European settlement in Australia, the areas where there was intense European settlement, there'd been total social and cultural destruction. So the 750 nations that the settlers initially encountered had been reduced by the late 1940s to about 250. But those 250 you could pretty well identify as to a substantial extent were in the areas, a large number of them, that this expedition covered. The expedition was extraordinary in the depth of its penetration of all facets of the ethnology and the fauna and flora and the geology of the area. About 30,000 new species were discovered during the course of that expedition. And most of the tribes that the expeditioners encountered were living essentially as though there had been little impact by European settlement. You might think that a bit surprising, but you know, in my lifetime in the 1980s, there was a community near Warburton who, for the first time, it was revealed, had seen a white man. And they'd been 200 years of European settlement before anyone in this community had actually seen a European. They'd heard rumours about them, but they had not seen a European. Anyway, to cut a long story short, agreements were breached. The original folk in the expedition had an instruction that whatever else they did, they were not to touch Aboriginal remains. Because Aboriginal remains were easy to identify. They were buried in public, effectively. And they broke it. That has to be said. They also did other things. I was associated with a conference that was being held at the conclusion of it. I was presenting the political side of what was basically a scientific conference, an anthropological conference, which was 60 years after the event, just before I came here. And the interesting thing was the fabulous reels and reels and reels of photographic, of film, of sound had all been put away in the 1950s as it was recognised that unknowingly, and to a degree knowingly, we just violated a whole range of sensitivities, cultural sensitivities in the Aboriginal community. And that the people who were being interviewed and filmed and taped had no idea of what technologies they were confronting. They'd done a proper discussion about the status of the men, and in one case the status of the women, what they were talking to. They'd made a determination that they were dealing with people who were probably senior elders. That was their view. And so they felt free to make statements to them and show them things, artefacts, dance, paintings that were appropriate to an elder of their equivalents. Yeah, and the idea of race sits very lightly inside the Aboriginal community, I might say. I won't go further on that, but that's interesting. Compared to just about any other community on earth, race consciousness is not strong. And so they shared this, and then to their horror, they saw it all on film. So women were seeing things that they should never see on the film. Men, because there was women involved, were seeing things that they should never see. And as the impact of that sunk in, there was a great concern. And so we just put it all away. There's some stuff came out in National Geographic, there was a few films and the like, but gradually we let it slide in embarrassment. And then we took it out on the 60th anniversary, and before displaying it, we ran across the tribes, the groups from the area. They loved it because they were so many generations removed. They did not feel that they were seeing anything that was offensive culturally. But they were also fascinated by the fact that they didn't do the things the way their great-grandparents did it, that clearly their ritual had changed. And so they thought that that was something that they could learn from, and they were not at all of the level of sensitivity that their great-grandparents and their grandparents had been. So that was all interesting, but there was leftover business because it was known that there was this group of remains that had been removed. And wonderfully, the Smithsonian came to the point of view that this had to be addressed. This had to change. And so the agreement was reached. The elders, 3 sets of elders came across to preside over it. They were wonderfully dealt with by the people who are responsible for this museum and its outreach centre, because the Native Americans understand absolutely the disturbance in the spirit world that is a product of mishandling of remains, because all societies have a consciousness of the significance of it and the danger to the people involved if they find themselves messing with it. So to put all this into these bodies, into a culturally significant Native American site, required a bit of tolerance, shall I say, from the Native American people. But they gave it. It was wonderful. It was terrific for the two Indigenous cultures to be able to reach like that. And so after an extraordinary complex ceremony, the remains went home. But it was a lesson to me and to all of us how extraordinarily difficult the removal of these remains has been culturally, psychologically, sociologically for the Australian Indigenous community. It was an excellent lesson for us. I'm very glad to see Mr. Snowball there, who was involved in that process. It was an interesting example of a success in this project.
I wonder if you might speak to us a little bit about sort of how things actually play out on the ground in Australia, in terms of international repatriation. So one of the things that one might imagine here would be, some kind of coordinating office, who knows where it sits, the State Department, the Department of Interior, somewhere that actually provides those kind of support mechanisms. It's sort of a little bit beyond our institution, for example, to do that. Can you give us a few hints about how it works there and what it might look like for us?
Well, it helps that it's a federally officially approved and funded process. That's the first point. That it is one which is going to be adequately resourced because for the movement of things and the movement of people associated with it, there is funding available. They don't actually have to worry about that. What they have to worry about is protocol. Mm-hmm. Now, the protocols have basically been, and there's an extensive protocol that is attached to the Act about how these things to be handled. The cultural protocols, the community consultation, research and study associated with it to prove up the provenance of the remains. It's the Australian Indigenous community is a heavily protocol-oriented community, and they work these things through very carefully. So really, once the location of remains has been identified and the relevant community activated, then they basically handle, from that point on, how things are to be done. That is not necessarily a fast process because there's not, shall I say, the Indigenous community is very anxious that they should be returned, point one. Point two, they're very anxious not to be involved in any way, shape or form unless they are the appropriate people to do it. So it's not as though you have a situation where you appoint a number of Australians of Indigenous origin and say, right, you're the men and women, you're going to handle no fear. They are not going to handle the bodies. They have no responsibility for them and there is danger to them in handling them. So we have to go through quite an elaborate process of identification. You then may get an identified person. Remember, these are folk who feel they have an obligation, but only an obligation if they really are responsible. And they may well arrive at a conclusion after having accepted responsibility that they're not. And somebody may be identified and then a relative challenge the person, or another clan or family challenge the person. Now, the person who is challenged is not going to be defensive about it. The weight of their sentiment will be to not do it, and if there is any challenge or to it out there. So you can actually get a process that takes weeks, if not months, to establish who it is who's going to go to collect them. These are not people who are looking for free trips globally. They're quite frequently like the elders who came to Australia, from Australia for the Smithsonian exercise. They did not like being here and they couldn't wait to get home. They wanted familiar ground. They wanted to be in country. They did not want to be involved. So there's and one became aware of one or two things which it's been extraordinary. The institutions have been very prepared to repatriate them, anxious that we remove them. but there's not a claimant. Now, of course, in some areas of Australia, the remains come from tribes which have been wiped out. They effectively have no provenance, and it's not easy establishing who would then accept responsibility for them, because another Indigenous tribe simply won't. That's all there is to it. It's not their business. And they don't want to mess with the spirit world. So there's the protocols are extensive. The process is really completely controlled by Indigenous Australians, and the funding is, they're of course reporting to a funding authority, but the funding authority is just that.
And maybe you could say a quick bit about just the extensiveness, the nature of, say, some of these bilateral agreements. I mean, one can imagine one that was sort of, conceptual mostly with the details to be worked out, or another version that might be very, very specific. So, for example, earlier today we heard about pesticide contamination of objects. This might be something that's written in the fine print, or something that absolutely doesn't make its way into the fine print. Or, for example, we had a conversation earlier today about standard of proof, reasonable doubt, preponderance of evidence, the unevenness of those kinds of things. Sounds like some part of that's going to be handled at the Aboriginal side. So are these extensive documents?
No, they're not. The Act is pretty extensive.
Yeah.
The protocol attached to it is pretty extensive. The actual agreements that we sign, well, I guess that's pretty much the agreement with the French. But it's not. It's a process which has got a high level of informality attached to it. I mean, you blindsided me slightly with the pesticides one. I've not actually heard that.
You don't have to address that one.
So I maybe need to go back and take a bit of a look at that. It's I think would probably be a little different from others. There have been Aboriginal sacred objects returned. Compared to some other societies, and I suspect, as is the case in the Native American society, objects are not that important to Aboriginals. They're there, but they don't have the level of saliency that they have in some other Indigenous communities. On the other hand, bodies are unbelievably problematic. And so there's the focus is really largely on getting things right with regard to that, and then establishing the proper ownership of it. Remembering always that nobody wants to do it. It's the thing that the Indigenous Australians who are identified as the source of this, well, they're not going to fight it if there's truth in it, but they're not going to go out of their way for an overseas trip. And they're not going to go out of the way to go out of country. Going out of country certainly for the still extant Indigenous tribes, that's not a good thing to do. And so it's not as though people won't accept responsibility, but these it was interesting. I'm going on too long, but it was interesting seeing them at the other part of this museum. We get there, we get the three elders come out, and they're quiet gentlemen, and then all of a sudden everything stops. None of us have any idea why it stops, but these three chaps sit off in a corner, and sporadically they talk to each other. So somebody will say something, you can't understand what's being said, and then nothing will be said for about 5 minutes. Then somebody else will say something, in about 10 seconds flat, nothing else is said for a few minutes, and so on, for about an hour. And what they were doing was sitting down and working out in which order the languages should be presented, in the knowledge that if it's not presented in the right order, then there will be no validity in the repatriation process, danger to those standing near the bodies and handling the bodies, and danger to the communities when they get home. So it's an elaborate, difficult process, and when they finally arrived at an agreement about an hour in, then the smoking ceremony and the removal of the remains concluded. So it's It's quite a complex process. Now, there's a number of remains that have been moved back to Australia that involve none of this at all. And when, for example, there's a sort of assumption that the people for whom with whom it was connected just simply can't be identified, and there's a high likelihood that they no longer exist, then the government just picks it up and sends it home and put it into a holding area with the provenance as far as it can be established attached to it, in case at some point of time somebody can arise who wants to claim it.
Well, I want to thank you, Ambassador Beazley, and